Crime as Language, Sophistry and Narcissism, Structural Parallels. Content: Sophistic or eristic dialectics according to Plato, Schopenhauer and the Art of Being Right, Operant Conditioning, Learned Helplessness and Introjects, 10 Manipulative Strategies according to Noam Chomsky, Sophistry and Narcissism, Structural Parallels, Propaganda and Crime, Governments as Perpetrators. Popular since antiquity, rhetorical tricks. It began in Plato's time. The Sophists were itinerant teachers of oratory who sold their teachings of rhetoric for money. They promised to make every student capable in politics so that he could hold an influential and lucrative office. Socrates argued with the Sophists. He sought truth, they sought profit. Plato, Protagoras. But is it that simple? Did not philosophy also sell itself and put itself in the service of ideologues? Were not ideologues also philosophers and vice versa? The Sophists placed themselves in great, often freely invented traditions and sported false credentials. Sophists like Protagoras also regularly attracted the most beautiful young men in town, like Alcibiades, as living advertising figures or as sexual objects. What are the differences between Sophists and philosophers according to Plato? Sophists are interested in personal power, while philosophers are interested in finding the truth. Sophists are interested in overcoming the opponent, while philosophers are interested in convincing the opponent. Sophists frequently use techniques of self-aggrandizement, enhancing their ego, narcissistic reference to social, cultural, or institutional grades or authorities, name-dropping. Philosophers make truthful statements about their own positions. If necessarily, they are even admitting their own knowledge deficits, and in general, they make more reference to the matter than to their own person. Sophists use long speeches or short speeches without reference to the content of the mediation situation, merely as an interruption. Philosophers use long or short speech adapted to the content of the communication situation. Sophists frequently use eristic dialectics. This is a Greek term, eristike techne, meaning the art of the speech duel, the art of being right, even when somebody is inferior in the matter, thus by unfair tricks. Philosophers, according to Plato, do not use eristic dialectics. The speech duel, elenchos in Greek, was a contest to the death in public esteem. Whoever lost in the speech duel was considered socially finished. In his dialogue Protagoras, Plato describes how the protagonist of the same name is treated like a celebrity in Athens. Also, he actually only sells empty phrases. But Protagoras is a master of black rhetoric, also called eristics or eristic dialectics. The business practice of the Sophists are a model of unfair competition which lives through and builds on instrumentalized rhetoric. Typical techniques are long speech, not letting the opponent finish, confusion of terms, isotopical modulation. For example, the sophist is speaking of liberty, liberties, occasional indulgences, while the philosopher is speaking of freedom. Techniques for self-aggrandizement, for example, Homer and Hesiod have already been sophists. Artifices to overcome the opponent. Let's have a closer look at the artifices. The art of being right even when you are wrong. Those who want to be right even though they are inferior in the matter must proceed unfairly. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote a book on how to be right in all cases by basically psychologically destabilizing the opponent. Eristic Dialectics, 1831. Schopenhauer mentions 38 unfair rhetorical tricks. The most popular techniques of eristic dialectics are, according to him, the following arguments. Ad rem, the matter is allegedly not true. Ad hominem, the matter does not agree with what the opponent has said. Ad personam, the opponent is ridiculed. Ex concessis, the opponent is forced to concede something incidental, and from this the falsity of his presentation is inferred. Interestingly, Schopenhauer says that some people use these unfair rhetorical attacks intuitively. Others need his training. Why does sophistry or black rhetoric work? Something as negative as the art of defaming one's opponent or entire groups in society might not be effective at first glance. Psychologically, people want to be affirmed in their self-esteem. But how does the acceptance of a devaluation work? Through two psychological mechanisms. In-group, out-group dynamic, learned powerlessness, learned helplessness, effects of operant conditioning. The result is that perfectly conditioned people continue to condition themselves. Even more, they consider their conditioning to be their own free will, because they believe that by following suggested messages they belong to the preferred group, or they misunderstand their own conditioning as fate, because they believe, due to learned helplessness, that they cannot change anything anyway. Learned helplessness is a psychological effect that occurs when people permanently internalize negative experiences and negative messages and make them part of their own self, as an introject, thus feeling a powerlessness to shape their own values and life circumstances in a self-determined way. This is exactly what black rhetoric and sophistry does since antiquity. It devalues the individual or the group to which they belong. In order to salvage a last vestige of self-respect, the devalued and helpless must deny themselves, join the stronger group that is currently being suggestively advertised, and continue to internalize the suggestive messages in a particularly docile manner. Sophistry and transactional analysis. The conditioning of helplessness through black rhetoric can be combined today with the insights of psychological transactional analysis according to Eric Berne. According to transactional analysis, there is the child ego, the adult ego, and the parent ego, which are active in the healthy adult as parts of the consciousness. Sophistry and mass suggestion makes use of this knowledge for the purpose of manipulation. Mass suggestion through black rhetoric identifies the receiver of the message with the child ego and the sender of the message with the parent ego, so that, as an effect, no power symmetry can arise in communication. Let us have a closer look at this asymmetrical structure of communication. Mass manipulation by the media, 10 strategies of manipulation according to Noam Chomsky. Reverse the attention. Create problems and deliver the solution. Step down wanted changes. Postpone unwanted changes. Speak to the masses as if they were little children. Concentrate on emotions, not on reflections. Try to maintain the ignorance of society. Create the idea in the population that they are average. Turn resistance into bad conscience. Get to know people better than they know themselves, thus creating elite knowledge. The weaponizing of language, as done by sophists old and new, has 3 core elements: ego boosting, devaluation of the receiver of the message, and repetition of the message. Protagoras claims that Homer and Hesiod have already been sophists, that the Olympian gods themselves made virtue a teachable subject and initiated the sophists as their mediators. This is called, in today's social psychology, the Berg effect, basking in reflected glory. It means self-valorization of the sender of the message through reference to celebrities, traditions, institutions, or today, the spider or spectre. It is the hierarchical representation of institutions. The sophist technique of black rhetoric, however, reinforces this method and touches the suggestive superiority of the sender of the message to again create the asymmetrical tension between parent ego, sender, and child ego, receiver. Powerlessness suggestion often works through verbal evocative or actual social and spatial isolation of the victim. Omnipresence, with its repetition effect, anchors the messages in the subconscious. The sophist uses Berg effect, impotence suggestion, and repetition to psychologically condition the recipient of his messages. But he is not only a user of suggestive techniques, he is also a type. He resembles the narcissist in differential diagnosis because his behavior, for example, devaluation, triangulation, gaslighting, is structurally very similar. Sophistry and Narcissism, structural parallels. Black rhetoric or sophistry, and malignant narcissism and antisocial personality disorder according to International Classification of Diseases or DSM-5, show many resemblances. Delusion of grandeur, boundary transgressions, aloof behavior, delusion of being above the law, devaluation of the victim to enhance their own status, isolation of the victim, triangulation, lack of empathy with simultaneous focus on own affects, creating problems to maintain control, pathological lying, gaslighting, creation of purposeful habits, for example, learned helplessness in the victim. When Schopenhauer said that some people are sophistical by nature, did he mean narcissists? Let us have a closer look at one technique frequently used by sophists and narcissists: gaslighting. Gaslighting is a sophistical technique to destabilize victims. The psychological term goes back to a play called Gaslight by Patrick Hamilton and the psychological thriller The House of Lady Alquist, starring Ingrid Bergman. Through systematic insinuation of perceptual errors and repeated false information, it is increasingly suggested to the victim that he or she is crazy, not in control of his or her own senses. Sophists use gaslighting to reinforce the learned powerlessness of their victims and to suggest to them that they are not quite right. Socrates warned, sophists are a danger to the soul. Malignant narcissists also habitually use this strategy. But not only individuals, also institutions, secret services such as the Stasi in Eastern Germany or CIA made use of some forms of gaslighting by entering houses in the absence of the victims and moving objects until the victims doubted their own perception. What if the narcissism underlying sophistry is not only an individual trait, but also intrinsic to the system? This idea is not new. the French nobleman, philosopher and writer Donatien Alphonse Marquis de Sade believed that the state, through black rhetoric and propaganda, together with the installation of instruments of power, ensured that innocence basically stood no chance. De Sade's despotic government ensured that corruption was omnipresent in all its instances: nobility, clergy, judiciary, administration, politics, trade, and was always bound to win in every case, just like a sophist. This is the plot of his famous work, Justine ou les malheurs de la vertu, published in 1791. What if black rhetoric, sophistry, and propaganda are a millennia-old technique for disempowering the masses? Governments as narcissistic perpetrators. The technique of propaganda as a means of influencing the masses dates back to antiquity, as does black rhetoric or sophistry. In the Middle Ages, the military ideas of manipulation were supplemented by and transferred into clerical propaganda by Pope Gregory XV in 1622, according to Edward Bernays. What has changed in the 21st century is the technical mass media reach of the methods and the possibility of influencing the recipient ever more widely and permanently. The strategies of temporarily influencing the receiver have historically given way to behaviorist strategies of operant conditioning, and today even strategies of changing the receiver of the message. What if the state takes on the role of the narcissistic sophist? Thank you for your attention.